land acknowledgement. I am honored to live and work as a guest in the land of the Southwest Indigenous peoples, including the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache. I acknowledge and respect the sovereign Indian nations and indigenous peoples of these lands. As a Mexicana border crosser, I reflexively honor Native American knowledges and worldviews. I invite each of you to also acknowledge the lands on which you stand and from where you are connecting with us today. I also want to continually recognize, and I want us to be self-reflexive about all the suffering that is happening and taking place across the country. I think of my family in California. I think of my family in Texas, who are experiencing a lot of consequences of the climate change, but also racial violence. I also invite you to offer prayers and thoughts to people who are suffering. I want to thank the support and the idea for this panel today that I'm very excited about. First of all, to Presidenta Mónica Torres, President of Doña Ana Community College, and Dr. Fame Camarena, Dean of the Honors College at NMSU. Muchas gracias for this great idea for this panel and for your support. You're gonna hear from several panelists today, and Mr. Jose Aranda will be moderating the Plática with us today. I also want you to know that we will be giving away posters and copies of the 25th edition of Borderlands La Frontera, La Grande, Gloria Anzaldúa. I also want to remind you that we will conclude Latinx Heritage Month on Thursday with two phenomenal speakers who will do a cross-racial dialogue around why we need to have allyships across race and across our differences. That will be from 5 to 7. I want to introduce you now to one of my femtors, La Doctora Mónica Torres. Mónica Torres may not remember, but in 2009, I was a young Mexicana, first generation student and scholar. I was still completing my doctoral studies at the University of Utah. And I came for a conference of my beloved national organization, Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social. It was 2009 and the conference took place here at NMSU. And Dr. Mónica Torres was elected as our Chingona Presidenta, chair for MALCS. And at the time, of course, I had a year left in my doctoral studies. And she doesn't remember this, or she probably does, but I made numerous calls to her to ask her why I should come to NMSU. So I am here because of you. I thank you. Sometimes I didn't appreciate all the effort that it took to get me here and to keep me here. Many of the conversations I've had with you, you know what they're about, revolve around that retention of faculty of color at this Hispanic serving institution, minority serving institution. And I thank you for being one of those femtors that I've had here at NMSU to keep me here, doing work that matters, porque vale la pena. Gracias, Doctora Mónica Torres, and now I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Judith. Judith, I do remember those calls, and I can't tell you how happy I am you came to New Mexico State and that you stayed here. Judith later became the chair of MALCS, kind of in later years. And I was very fortunate to be on that board with her for about 5 years, I think. And so I value your work, Judith, so thank you. I appreciate all the work you did to pull this panel together. I truly appreciate that. My thanks to the panelists, to the Honors College, to Chicano programs for making all of this happen. And thank you for the technical expertise for making it happen as well. I'm very happy to be here. I'm looking forward to hearing the expertise gathered in this space to address a set of incredible issues. And before we began, Dulcinea Lara said something like, it's about time we had these sorts of conversations. It's past time we had these conversations. And so I'm looking forward to the what I think will
this meeting is being recorded.
What will be a rich experience tonight. I want to start by just recounting a couple of stories from very, very early in my career. When I started to teach at the college level. One is when I started my career at community colleges, and then another story is when I was at the university. I remember I would call roll in developmental English classes. And as I did so, I might ask a student about the pronunciation of her name. I said, "Do you prefer Maria or Maria?" And she would look at me shyly and say, "Oh, it doesn't matter." And I knew instinctively that it did matter. And that I would invite her often to have a conversation with me about her name and her family, where she came from. But I was always really struck by that. And then a number of years later, when I was teaching Chicano literature, I would have students introduce themselves and talk about their ethnic identity. And many of the students, I would say probably 90% of the students at the start of the semester would use the term Hispanic for themselves. And as the semester went on, reading people like Lorenz Aldua, Pat Mora, Rodolfo Anaya, and many others, they started to think about Chicano and Chicana as a term that might fit them. And these are two kind of pretty straightforward. And I would guess that anybody who's worked with Chicana students can tell you these sorts of stories. But what they taught me was not that a student should or should not identify in one way or another. But what they taught me is that identity is complex. It's not just tied to historical events or to sociological data, but to our bodies and our psyches and the way we talk about ourselves. Identity is wholly connected to language, how we are talked to, how we are talked about, and how we articulate ourselves. Those were some of the first lessons I started to learn from students who came to study in the classrooms that I was teaching in. Now, we're not at all in the same place that we were when I started my career some 30 years ago. But we're not in the clear either. This summer has made that abundantly clear. Recent actions by the federal government have made that abundantly clear. I'm grateful for the conversations like the one that will happen tonight, because they are critical. And maybe we say this all too often, but I feel it true. Perhaps they are more critical now than ever. And so I welcome you to the conversation. I invite us all to learn and think about the ideas that are being put forward, the assertions that are being made, the challenges that will be issued for all of us to think and reflect on where we are, who we are, and perhaps where we need to go next. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, my colleague, Jose Aranda.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torres. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jose Aranda. I'm a librarian and a part-time history instructor at Doña Ana Community College, and it's my pleasure to serve on this panel this evening. Let me introduce to you the panelists. Dr. Manuel Bustamante. He's an associate professor at Western New Mexico University. Teaches courses in instructional technology and design, bilingual education, and social studies methodology that incorporates ethnic studies. We have Eduardo Estrada. He is a graduate student and a New Mexico field representative for Endangered Species Coalition. Eddie also has over 10 years of experience in public education, from teaching high school social studies to working in higher education, specifically in medical residency. He has a BA in political science from University of Texas, El Paso, and pursuing his master's in education at New Mexico State University. And he can directly trace his family roots in the New Mexican region, in New Mexico, as far back as the 16th century. Eddie is committed to getting more young people and minorities involved in the political process by helping educate citizens on how to elevate their voices. He has taken active and leadership roles in the Democratic Party at both the county and state levels, and continues to work on improving his community. Dr. Dulcinea Lara is director of the Borderlands and Ethnic Studies program and an associate professor in the Criminal Justice Department at New Mexico State University. She identifies as Chicana Indígena, honoring her Apache and Raramuri ancestry that is deeply rooted in the region now called Southern New Mexico. Dr. Lara earned her PhD in Comparative Ethnic Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Her teaching and research center on the critical viewing and questioning of systems and knowledges that are designed and operationalized to advance some people groups while creating obstructions for others. Dr. Lara's scholarship is multi-method and multimedia. Cynthia Wise is also a graduate student and journalist with a master's in educational leadership and policy studies and a bachelor's in government. She's an award-winning journalist. She's currently pursuing her PhD. She's on her third year in the College of Education's Leadership and Administration program. She studies the links between diversity initiatives and student success. She has a master's from the University of Washington and a bachelor's in government from New Mexico State University. She's a proud graduate of Gadsden High School, which is one of the reasons why she said she returned to New Mexico. Dr. Nicolás Natividad is an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at New Mexico State University. His teaching and research interests focus on civil and human rights. He is the co-creator of the museum exhibit, Rotando Pasos Ajenos, Social Justice and Inequalities in the Borderlands, and a former fellow in the New Leadership Academy at the University of Michigan. He's an advocate for community engagement initiatives and believes education should offer outlets for students to learn from and give back to their communities. Those are our panelists. And we will begin with a round robin of sorts. If each of the panelists can mention a few things about identity. In preparation for this, I, as a librarian and historian, I was researching what some of these terms mean. Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicana, Hispanic. And it's quite interesting. There are many, many resources available freely online that branch out into different directions. So instead of lecturing on that, I want to leave it open for my panelists to say what they feel and share how they identify. So we'll start with Dr. Manuel Bustamante, please.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Manuel Bustamante, and I'm happy to be here with you. I personally identify as Chicano for a couple of reasons. It respects the duality that resides in me. Of course, being part Spanish, and then of course it honors the indigenous roots that I come from. And we suspect that part of that is actually Raramuri. Jose.
Thank you. Eddie.
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. So personally, I also use Chicano as my identity, more so as a term of reverence for the movement that I felt empowered the people and kind of took back ownership of identity. And I think it was passed down to me through my family. My father was very aware of the movement back in the 60s and 70s, and it was always discussed in my household growing up. So if you can tell with the artwork that I have in my office here, I have La Causa flag, I have the calendario behind me. It really stuck as a symbol of pride and identity that motivates the work that I do today. Jose?
Thank you, Dr. Lara. Doctora Lara.
Hi, everyone. I can't see the audience, but I want to reach out and say thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. As Jose mentioned earlier, I self-identify as Chicana Indígena. And like Eduardo, I identify with a social movement that happened about 50 years ago in the 1960s and 70s by people who had been agitating and advocating for many years prior to that. Many of them children of people involved in World War II, whether as military or people contributing to a national sacrifice. So I identify with Chicana because it's a name that's born of sacrifice and struggle. And the Indigena part, it has to do with my roots in this area of learning about our ancestry in my family that's been here for 6 and 7 generations on both sides, of connection to the land, connection to Apache land and Raramuri peoples in this region. So I call myself that, but it comes with a lot of weight, which I think we will explore in this panel. Thank you.
Cynthia Wise?
Thank you, Jose. I'm going to follow up with something that Dr. Torres said, that identity is complex. I was raised racialized as white, and it's only in investigating my genealogy that I realized that I come from colonizers and colonized people. I am Mexicana, indigenous, English, Irish, a whole bunch of things. So I don't check boxes for the government or the university or anybody else. My identity is Cynthia. That's who I am, and that's what I profess.
Thank you. And Dr. Natividad.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and spending your time with us and growing in these issues and these topics that are just so important. So I identify as Chicano. I was raised in the border region, 6th generation to have been raised here. So the border, as many people in this region have said, the border has crossed us. We didn't cross the border. And so what that means is being Chicano, you start to understand the two worlds that you're straddling at all times. And so I think Gloria Anzaldúa talked a lot about the word Napantla, which came from a Nahuatl word meaning torn between ways or in the middle. And so growing up straddling two identities, straddling the middle, straddling two different cultures, two different languages, I think there's a special place that border residents understand the interstitial places. So I'll stop there.
Personal stories or journeys. I relate to much of what's been shared so far, but I'm from San Diego, California, and as you know, it's a border town like here. And grew up speaking Spanish, learned English in school, and then this is my experience, right? So speaking Spanish outside of the home was not supported, was not viewed positively. So I began to lose that little by little. In fact, I remember one of my coaches in baseball telling me, I forgot the context of the conversation, but he told me that I was a pocho, apparently because I didn't speak Spanish properly. And anyways, I remember that word sticking to me, and I didn't like it. And then later on in high school, I learned about Chicano, and in college, of course. And then I moved to Miami, Florida, where, muchos Latinos, everyone thinks it's just Cubans. Yes, they are there, but it's actually, I think it's called the gateway to the Americas, because it's just more than just Cubans, South Americans, Central Americans. And so living there and working in the community, I began to use my Spanish and improve my Spanish. And then now, 15 years later, I'm here. Please share your journeys or stories briefly that help identify you today. And we'll start with Dr. Bustamante.
Thank you again, Jose. Well, I like history and I like story. So this evening, what I would like to do is talk a little bit about Mexican history. But because of the events that occurred, I think we can also consider it part of US history. I also like to intertwine that with story, specifically my family story. Let's start off with the Mexican Revolution, which occurred between 1910 and 1920. This was a bloody struggle between many groups in the fight for power. It ended the dictatorship, and it was the establishment of a new constitutional republic. Now, the two battles that I like to speak to this evening are the Battle of Ciudad Juarez, which occurred April the 7th through May the 10th, 1911. This was a major battle during the Mexican Revolution, and it pretty much ended the first phase of the Mexican Revolution. This is where Porfirio Diaz lost his rule and was replaced by Francisco Madero. The next battle I would like to discuss, and it closely relates to my family, is the Battle of Columbus, which occurred March 8th and the 9th, 1916. Now, during this period, Pancho Villa was around the northern part of Mexico. He was in dire need of supplies and resources at that time. He thought, well, I can raid Columbus and resupply what is needed. So what he did was he sent in a spy. His spy went in, looked at what was going on, came back and reported to Francisco Villa and said, you know what? There's only about 50 soldiers protecting this little town. This emboldened Pancho Villa. So the next morning, he set off to raid the town. To his surprise, he was met by a strong resistance by the US military and well-armed townspeople. Because of this, it sent him back in retreat to Mexico. Now, during this period, two men who were family members of mine were involved in either one of those events or both. My grandfather, Guadalupe Espinosa, who came into the United States in 1905, was here already. So as a result, he was fighting either under General Pershing or he was one of the townspeople protecting his family. The other person related to me, Jose Reyes, was fighting for the other side under the command of Pancho Villa. Now, rumor has it that he wasn't too happy with this arrangement or the accommodations, so he decided to hide. He did this by burying himself in the sand and waited until Pancho Villa and his villistas left. This, of course, allowed him to cross back into the United States, and that's how he became, or he came to the United States. Now, the story doesn't end there. It gets better. Two women, Paulita and Luz, sisters. Don Guadalupe Espinosa, my grandfather, married Luz, and my tío Jose Reyes married Paulita. And that is how that part of the family came together. Can you imagine the stories told by these two couples around the kitchen table at that time? Thank you.
Dr. Lara.
Hello. In thinking about our personal journeys, I always talk about how I left when I was young to go to Michigan, and I ended up going to Michigan State University from Gadsden. Those of you who know Gadsden High School, my colleagues here on the call. I went to Michigan State because it was a top journalism university. And when I got there, I was recruited to be in MECHA, which is the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. It's a group of students that rose organically from community who in the 1960s were agitating for ethnic studies classes, Chicano studies classes. And ironically, it took leaving this area to learn about New Mexico when I was in Michigan. I had a history professor from Juarez and a Chicana professor from El Paso. And I was super fascinated by everything that they taught me. Am I good? Took Chicano studies classes, African American studies classes, Native American studies classes. And I realized how little of this information I knew about myself and about my community. And I was very angry. I realized that there were many important pieces of information that I didn't learn growing up that would explain the situations of Southern New Mexico. Things like poverty, violence. I grew up in Berino, a colonia, right, that lacks a lot of protections and infrastructure. I learned that there's a history to human relationships that exacerbate these feelings of shame and guilt, the experiences of sexism, of homophobia, and especially of racism. I learned a lot about the different kinds of racism at the individual level, structural, lateral, internalized. There are so many kinds. And while I tell my students there's not really a right answer to any problem, I think that learning history, learning world history helped me really understand and contextualize what was happening at home. And also helped me hone critical thinking skills. So I started to explore ethnic studies classes and went on to get my PhD in ethnic studies so that I could teach conceptually about how human beings relate to each other across our differences, right? And so when I went on to get my PhD, I realized that this lack of information isn't by chance, right? This lack of information is actually, it's by design, it's intentional. And it's really interesting that, you know, at a Hispanic serving institution, minority serving institution like New Mexico State University, that it's sometimes hard to have these conversations, that of the entire faculty, less than 10% are Latino, about 5% are Mexican American, Chicano. And I'm a strong advocate for good professors of all kinds. However, with a population that's close to 60% Chicano students, there's an imbalance there with representation. So my journey led me away from home to learn about home and then to see things in other places of the world that were fascinating to me. One of the things that really impressed me when I lived in Berkeley, California, was they have a tool library. And I went once with my roommate to check out a hammer and some carpentry tools. And you could get a wheelbarrow, you could get a lawnmower, you could get a Phillips screwdriver. And I was so fascinated by this idea that not everyone has to own everything, that you can share things. And so I always use this example here at home. What would it look like to have a lending library for tools? You know, we're a very a tool using people. And people, when I bring that up, they say, oh, they laugh. They say that people will ruin it. They'll destroy things. They'll steal things. It won't work. And so in ethnic studies, what I've learned is that it's really about knowing ourselves and knowing our communities so well that we can rebuild the trust that was broken through colonization, that was broken through war, that was broken and ruptured, right? And so if we stay timid and mistrusting of each other, that's partially how racism works, to keep each other separated and isolated. And so really what we learn a lot about in my classes is history. And we go back to like 300 AD, you know, we don't just start with the 1960s movement. We don't start with the 1800s. We go back to when Religion was influential in having us think in binary ways, right? And thinking there's only good and bad, there's only right and wrong. So what does it mean to explode that and return to being contemplative, to being complex thinkers and problem solvers? So my journey has taken me from being a really angry 18-year-old in Michigan to being very free and being very excited to meet people where they are and learn how we can be a healthier society.
Thank you. So these terms, Latinos, Latinas, Hispanic, etc., as we've already mentioned, they have a historical connotation, right? They all have a linguistic component and a geographic. But living here in this area, we have a border. And I'd like to hear from Dr. Natividad to talk about what it means to live near the border and what kinds of identities come from that. Dr. Natividad?
Sure. So I want to start off actually by just telling the brief story about when I was deciding on going to college. I graduated high school in El Paso, and I was thinking of where I wanted to study, and I knew three things. I wanted to study in Mexico City, I wanted to study in New York, and I wanted to study in Spain. So when I told my parents this, they're like, well, are you crazy? Like, that's just insane. Who's going to pay for all this, right? That's the first question. But what was interesting is what my uncle had told me. I'll never forget when I was telling my uncle I was thinking about studying Mexico City. He said, well, you're going to learn just how American you are. So sure enough, I left. I studied. I was blessed enough to study in Mexico City. And he was right. I learned how absolutely American I was. Even though I grew up on the border, eating all the foods, speaking all the right language, right? I realized just the cultural values, right, that had been instilled were separate and different. Then I came home and I said, I want to study in New York now. And I'll never forget. He said, well, there are no Mexicans there. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go study in New York. Now, there are no Mexicans there is not right? Clearly there are Mexicans in New York, but in terms of the majority being Mexican is what he meant. And so it was fascinating just to see the comparison of what I was not, right, and what I am in those two places. And then, of course, I was fortunate enough to study in Spain as well, but that's just stories about tapas and siestas every day, right? And that's a whole nother side, right? But I think what's important about this is understanding, again, which side of the fence do we always live in, right? And for me, that journey was partly to understand, well, do we have to have a fence? Right? Does there always have to be this dualistic thinking, I am one thing or the other? And so this complexity that comes with understanding identity, especially now more than ever in these times, we have this dualistic thinking where one person can be one thing or the other, and we compartmentalize people. And this has been going on for centuries, right? And so I just want to give you a brief example. You're living in 1811 in the border region, right? And this was, you're growing up, right, with your indigenous roots, you're indigenous to the region, and you're speaking your indigenous language, right? And all of a sudden, you get to an age where you have to go to school, compulsory school, and it's taught by Spanish priests, right? So you go to the school and they said, okay, we know you're indigenous, right? This is 1811, right? But we need you to speak Spanish. We need you to eat these foods, and we need you to act this way, the Spanish way. And so again, think of dualistic thinking. So now you can't be one thing, you have to be another. So then, okay, you're now another thing. So you're this thing called Spanish. But just a few years later, 1821 hits, and what happens? Mexico declares independence with Spain. So you're in school again, and they're like, okay, remember how we told you you're Spanish? Well, scratch that. You're now Mexican. You have allegiance to a national identity called Mexico. Okay, well, okay, I'm Mexican now. There's cultural values, shifts, right? All these things. So then just a few years after that, this is in the same region, right? You're now probably in high school. The Texas Rebellion of 1836 hits, right? And then all of a sudden they pull you in. Okay, remember that whole thing about Mexican? Scratch that. You're now Tejano. You want you to be a Tejano. You have no longer any allegiance to the Mexican authority or government. Okay, so I'm a Tejano now, right? I got this. I understand it, right? Now I'm ready to enter college, right? Sure enough, you enter college, and what happens? The U.S. annexes Texas in 1845, right? Followed by the Mexican-American War of 1845. So now, forget speaking Spanish, forget your allegiance to anything else, Tejano, right? And now you're American. You have to eat hamburgers. I don't know if they eat hamburgers right back then, but the food, right? The shifts and all that was still there. And so in one lifetime, in one generation, right, someone had to jump back and forth between fences. I'm now this, I'm now that. I have allegiance to this, I have allegiance to that. And I think we don't talk about the complexity of that history. We don't talk about how dualistic thinking has really impoverished us, right? I mean, Gloria Anzaldúa puts it perfect and says, we are suffering, we're inflicted with this notion of dualistic thinking. We have to think on one side of the fence or the other. And as a result, we dehumanize others. And so in one person's lifetime, they experience this in an extreme form, dualistic thinking. And I think of my ancestors who lived through this. And I think of people in border residents who have been through this, and it's in their DNA, that trauma that they experienced. It's in their DNA. They passed it down to ours, right? The trauma lives within us. And so I hope this conversation can continue about the complexity behind this history, the trauma, and how can we think outside dualistic thinking.
Thank you. Any other panelists wish to chime in before we move on to the next topic? So our next topic is healing. I think in finding identity, that one way to get there is through conflict, is through some of these binary or duality perspectives that have already been brought up. But this next concept of healing, I'd like Ms. Cynthia Wise to talk about her journey in self-identifying and how she uses the process of healing herself.
Thank you, Jose, and Dr. Natividad. The dualistic thinking is part of what got me to where I am. I was raised in my younger years in Seattle, which was and is a very segregated city. I can remember very specifically the first person of color that I ever met, Todd Weeks, was in the 8th grade class. He was the only Black student in my junior high school. There were no Black teachers. There was no people of color in administration. Fast forward to high school, and my mother had heard some things that led her to want to move to southern New Mexico to be near her sister down in Anthony. And so I went from a very white existence to becoming the minority. As I mentioned, I went to Gadsden High School, very proud of the fact that I went there along with 2 other members of the panel, and experienced what white privilege really means. I had our high school counselor was counseling me into going to college. I wanted to be a disc jockey, and she was helping me fill out my college applications, helping me write my college essays, while at the same time counseling people who were much smarter than I, that they needed to go into the service industry or go into law enforcement. One of my classmates is now a district judge because thankfully, years later in life, he didn't listen to that advice. Another member is a professor of education at Western New Mexico University. When I graduated from high school, I started in college. My mother passed away and I decided I'm moving back to Seattle and I'm going to be a disc jockey. And did that for a while, moved back to El Paso because I missed the people. I missed the culture. I missed interacting with a variety of people. Worked in El Paso radio for a while, El Paso television as both a reporter and in news management, and then went back to Seattle. And it was there, I'm going to read you a real quick quote that I heard Bill Gates say something one Sunday morning. He said he was speaking to the National Governors Association about how obsolete the US education system is. And as part of his speech, he said, once we realize that we are keeping low income and minority kids out of rigorous courses, there can be only two arguments for keeping it that way. Either we think they can't learn, or we think they're not worth teaching. The first argument is factually wrong. The second is morally wrong. And it was that quote that set me on my path. I started trying to figure out is what he said accurate? Is it true that people were being tracked into less rigorous coursework? And I remembered back to high school, where even though people who are racialized as white were the minority in the school, the majority of people in my college prep English class were white, which seemed awfully strange in a school that was 90% Hispanic. And I thought back to being helped with my college essays, and I decided I needed to go back to school. That's when I went to the University of Washington to get a master's degree in education leadership to try to figure out, why is this happening? At the time I was working in news in Seattle, working at a television station there, and that influenced the kind of stories that we did in trying to address systemic inequities that exist, not only in society, but specifically in education, where kids who, quite honestly, are still tracked into less rigorous coursework, even though now they call it ability grouping. That way kids don't feel they're being marginalized. They're with kids who are like-minded and have similar abilities. And once I got my master's degree, I continued working in television, and I saw that things weren't changing. And I talked to people who went to the same high school. Dr. Lara went to the same high school 20 years after I did, and had almost exactly the same experience as some of my classmates. And I thought, what can I do to help change that? What can I do to try to bring about some kind of equity in education? It's an uphill battle, but I'm somebody who's a fighter, and it's every chance I get, I want to talk about equity in education, equity in the system, whether it be in education or in healthcare or any other aspect of life, housing. Why is the system the way it is, and what can we do to fix it? And for me, my heart is social justice. And I think that's the only way that we can fix that, is becoming involved in everything. And the only way I felt I could become truly involved is to get those letters at the end of my name, so that it's Cynthia Wise, PhD.
Thank you. Minorities can often be portrayed, especially in the media, as being non-conforming and angry at times. Anyone in the panel would like to elaborate on emotional connotations with this identity that we're talking about? Dr. Lara, are you angry anymore?
Good question, Jose. I talk about righteous anger You know, when I started learning these histories and these truths that started to explain poverty and violence and lack of opportunity. And, you know, I come from a community where you can't drink the water out of the tap, and it's 20 miles south of here. You know, that's something to be angry about. And so, yes, learning these histories can make you very angry. I tell my students that I was really on fire as an undergrad. And as I started to learn and be involved in Mecha and be involved in the community where I lived, I would make these PowerPoints and handouts, and I would come home to Berino and I would talk to anyone that would listen to me, because I felt like everyone needs to know this. In fact, when I did my senior thesis at Michigan State University, I interviewed 15 sets of 3 generations of self-identifying Chicanos in Michigan who had these histories of being campesinos and being migrant workers from Mexico all the way to Michigan for the beets and the cherries and the apple harvest. And so I interviewed people in Michigan thinking, well, they won't really identify as Chicano or Mexican American. And they did. All of them did, from young people to elders, talked about Chicano pride, and they knew their Mexican ancestry. They knew their ancestors. And so I wrote this thesis. And then when I came home that summer before I went to graduate school, I asked the same questions of the people in my community. And a lot of them said, I'm American, I'm white, I had one, there was one elder that I asked, what is your ethnicity? And he said, red, white, and blue. And so it was very interesting to me that there was this very high ethnic pride in Michigan, so far away from Mexico, and yet here along the border, there was something going on with I would say assimilation, or this like lack of history, and also the punishment when you tried to assert your identity, right? So it wasn't just, it's not ignorance, it's that there's punishment associated with asserting yourself, your humanity. And so, like Cynthia was mentioning, my fellow Panther pride here is when I was in high school in the 90s, you know, there was still kind of not a corporal punishment, but there was an ideological punishment where people talked about those Mexicans. And because I was considered a promising student, I was ushered away from everything that I wanted to do, right? I wanted to take Spanish class, and I was told to take French class. I so badly wanted to play wall ball during lunch because it looked so fun. And, you know, there was a teacher who told me, you know, you don't play wall ball, you know, how about tennis, even though it's the same thing, right? The extracurriculars were about assimilating me into some kind of expected behavior, right? So I can see now that there's a trauma that comes from this benevolent behavior that's actually racist, right? And so no one's unpacking this truth, no one's telling the truth. And so when I went to college and learned the history of my region, I knew that the trauma could be undone by identifying it. Right. And I experienced that, as Monica was saying, like in the identity of my selfhood, the identity of my body. I recognized that we don't have to be racially stratified. We don't have to be existing in a patriarchal structure. We don't have to put up with homophobia, right? These behaviors are manufactured over time. They're not human norms. They are not what we do because we are born into that. We have been conditioned. And part of that has to do with minimizing ourselves, right? The story that Dr. Torres told about Maria at the beginning of this meeting is so common, where you say, do you want to be called Maria or Maria, right? We're taught to make ourselves small. We're taught to, and Maria doesn't even say Maria. She says, whatever, you know, it doesn't matter to me. And so this ingrained sense of assimilation is actually an act of self-denial. So when people ask you to assimilate, they're asking you to negate yourself, negate your full humanity. And so I often tell people it's as simple, like studying human relationships is as simple as asking, how much do I contort myself on a daily basis to make other people comfortable? Right. And I tell my students this when they start saying, Dr. Lara, racism ended in the 60s, you know, I ask them to keep a journal of how often do you have to make yourself small so someone else can be big, right? and keep a track of that so that you can see that sort of determines your self-worth in our society, right? And so when we talk about healing, there's a lot of tears being shed in my classes. We watch different films where, it looks at the study of true selfhood. Something like Precious Knowledge is a good documentary to look at how this education has been thwarted over time. Then I turn the lights on and my students are wiping their tears away. And this past year, I have a lot of Chicano students in my classes, but we're very mixed. But this last year, I had a student from Japan, and she was really shocked by the reaction to Precious Knowledge. And she said, "I don't get why everyone's so emotional. Don't you learn about your history here? Don't you learn about who you are?" And the students started crying even more because the answer is no. And all the people here on this call are saying that. So I think part of healing, Jose, to answer your question about am I still angry, I think there's a logic to this anger, but how do we channel that anger to recognize that we don't have to live this way, right? And so I think activism is one form of channeling that anger, but I think what we need more than activism is organizing, right? We need to be organized to understand our community, organized to understand ourselves, and then organized enough to ask, what do our communities actually need, and how do we get that? So I think that's the moment that we're in right now, is not just the education and the being woke. Now what is needed in Las Cruces, in the border, in the colonias, in this region? So I think I sound angry to people, but I like to contextualize that I'm emotional because I know it doesn't have to look this way, and I know I shouldn't have to feel this way, and that there's an answer. So that's my answer, Jose.
Thank you. A couple comments from the chat from Dr. Monica Torres. Righteous anger so effectively points to the reasons why people are angry and should be angry. This notion of speaking up, I think these last several years have given us more than enough reason to. And this stereotypical, history of being complacent and quiet, I think deserves to be looked at. But this topic of organization, Dr. Lara, that you were talking about, let's transition into the celebratory part of the panel discussion. And let's talk to Eddie about what he's done to organize people in the community and in activism. Eddie.
Thank you so much. So a little bit about me and how I came to get involved with organizing. I saw the examples of what Dr. Lara spoke of and Cynthia, of the gaps in the curriculum in the high school setting, for Chicanos and for our presence to be so American, predating the country, the political boundaries, but yet we're mentioned so little in history textbooks. I saw that. I have high school books, in my possession in my library back here, and I think I counted maybe 2 to 3 pages that talked about Chicano contributions to America. And I also saw a lot of social issues that broke my heart in the high school setting. I had students that were high school students that did not know how to read, fell through the cracks. Don't know how that happened, but did not know simple cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. I had a valedictorian who dropped out. Well, he was set to be the valedictorian at the end of the year. He was 3 months away from graduation, but he dropped out because he had to work. And so talking about that righteous anger, seeing these heartbreaking stories really motivated me to put my effort into empowering the community to insert themselves in places and spheres of influence. And that's kind of where my work has taken me today. So about 4 years ago, I I was motivated by some of the rhetoric that was being openly spewed on television, specifically by a presidential candidate. And I identified with the people who was speaking against. And how did that happen? You know, I had thought that this country had maybe made more strides towards equality and acceptance, and yet there was this political party and then this far right wing of conservatism that was speaking these hateful things. And I really decided to get involved at that point. And I thought there was going to be others that looked like me, you know, being in an area that is predominantly Mexican American. When I decided to get involved with the political party here in Doña Ana County, there wasn't many faces that looked like me. Not very many young people, and very few Latinos or Chicanos. And I questioned why. And I was not really accepted at first as well. But having that righteous anger, I felt very compelled to insert myself. Well, they didn't respond, and nobody really wanted to show me the ropes. Well, I'm going to put myself in that spot, regardless of my acceptance. And slowly but surely, you know, I got involved as a district director. Then I ran for vice chair of the Democratic Party, and that's where I'm at now. And then my work also got me involved in environmental justice. But I see this constant theme of a lack of Latino voices in these spaces. And that's very unfortunate, you know, because sometimes we do see brown faces, but they're merely conduits for the existing power structure. They're merely a brown face that thinks like the establishment, like the Anglos. And I think we need to shift activism and involvement in these activities to actually move away from tokenism into directing the narrative. You know, we need to take back the narrative of these spaces and really insert ourselves. And so there's so many challenges that I've seen from keeping people involved. But you know, for me, having that sense of identity directs my activism. Having that sense of identity helps me insert myself in spots where maybe I'm not welcomed, but I'm needed. And so, you know, it compels me. Am I angry? I wouldn't say I'm angry, but I think having the identity as the wind behind my back really helps me stay involved, because if I'm not there, then who is? You know, if I don't speak up, then who does? And I think we all need to ask ourselves those questions, because if we don't do it, if we're not doing the work that we do, then who else will do it for us?
Thank you, Eddie. Anyone else on the panel wish to say something with being organized in our communities or under this topic of celebration? If not, I was going to say, you know, Latinos, we're very prideful people. And I think it's a blessing that we can demonstrate that pride in celebratory actions, especially if they involve the community, family. You know, some of the values that we value highly. In my experience in living in South Florida, you know, this aspect of celebrating was very popular, almost to the point of commercialized. There are some stereotypes, albeit that, you know, portray, especially like, for example, the city of Miami, as being this, real high energy town with lots of activity and fun, and it is. But the people, the 5 years that I lived there, the people that I saw and experienced, bring that from wherever part of the world they came from. So I think it's an asset to celebrate that. But New Mexico, so my experience was, I told you a little bit about growing up in San Diego and being shunned, a little bit about my home identity, speaking Spanish at home. And then when I lived in South Florida, I too saw, for lack of a better word, a caste system. There were certain ethnicities, certain people from certain countries that saw themselves more aloof than others. I'm not going to mention who they were, but I saw it. You get to find out about some of these things after living there a little while. But moving to New Mexico, I never felt that. I felt a sense of a balance because the history is so ingrained here. Spanish is intermingled with English, the foods, the holidays, the border, the history. It's just a real amazing experience. And so I'm married to a woman from South America, Venezuela specifically, and our daughter is growing up. I'm really, really proud and happy that she's growing up here because of the mixtures of cultures and identities, and it's really rich. I try to be there for her and educate any kind of situation that resembles my past. But I want to open up to the panel members for any last words on celebration, on identity, any of the things that we've talked about so far. Dr. Manuel Bustamantes.
Okay, Jose, thanks again. That's just, I like story, and these ideas that the panelists are sharing reminded me of another story, specifically my mother. And these stories that I share with you actually have influenced my identity to become who I am today. My mother was a very giving person, to the point that she would give, she would invite my friends over for lunch, dinner, whatever. In fact, it was the house to hang out in. What is interesting is that she and I would go shopping or whatever, and when we would come back home, under the carport was usually a sandia, a sack of onions, or other items. And I would ask my mom, well, who gave that to us? And she would say, well, I'm not sure. But that didn't matter. My mom was a very giving person. And I think in return, people gave to her, and as a result, to the family. So that's only one story I can add to this, Jose, and I can add many, many more if you would like.
Thank you for that. Any last words, Eddie?
I just want to remind everyone that we have elections going on. We have early voting. We have election day coming up in about 3 weeks. And I just want to remind everybody to get involved. I'm a big Democrat, that's no lie, but regardless on which side of the aisle you fall on, get involved in your community, vote like your life depends on it, vote not only for yourself, but for the next generation. We are passing on the torch to our children, their children, and what we do today is going to impact the life that they live tomorrow. So please vote, get involved, and thank you so much.
I
Thank
want
you, Eddie.
to add something, Jose, in terms of celebration. There's a big move to change social studies standards in K through 12 in New Mexico. And I sit on a committee at the state level with Dr. Bustamante. There are actual concrete conversations happening to make all of what we're talking about a reality for youth in New Mexico. And so I'm really excited to hopefully foster and facilitate some of that next summer in a writing institute, to actually put these stories on paper and to organize them so that all teachers have access to teaching the things that we all are lamenting that we didn't have. So I think things are changing. For me, that's a huge celebration. It's a celebration that we have ethnic studies at New Mexico State University now, which we didn't for 50 years. So that's a huge celebration. And I think that ethnic studies has come a long way. I think that it's really about thinking in complex ways, like all of my panelists here have mentioned, my co-panelists. How do we think about problems as they exist now with a historical background? How do we relate to each other? How do we form partnerships? And how do we support each other? There's a challenge with representation in Las Cruces and across the region. How do we change our museums? I was at the Railroad Museum in Las Cruces this weekend, and all the pamphlets feature white children that look white. I don't know if they're actually white, but there's no brown kids in the pamphlets, which tells me that someone in the city is not paying attention to what our city looks like. How do we change the museum so that they're more inclusive, more welcoming? Our schools, what we see in public art, right? Do we want another statue of a conquistador or a pistol slinging cowboy, or do we want something that represents agriculture or nature? I mean, we're in a time of cultural contest. We're in a time of deciding who are we as a region, right? Who do we want to be as a community? What does a healthy community look like? So I think this is a really exciting time, and I really hope that people who are listening in the audience ask good questions in your own circles of influence, talk about these things, and be courageous. Because of what's happening in the streets, it doesn't take as much courage as it used to. There's people in the streets that are sacrificing so that we in our committees and in our meetings and in our organizations can speak up and say, we need more of what's accurate, right? At least for young people coming up. So I just think there's so many areas where we can improve our communities right now. And I think that's a celebration.
Thank you. Cynthia, any last thoughts?
I think Dr. Natividad had a comment.
Never ask a journalist if they have something more to say. It's not safe.
Dr. Natividad?
Sure. So I think what Dr. Lara was pointing out was so important that the story that I was talking about earlier about the early part of the borderlands when borders were shifting, right? Constant shifts in borders. There are also constant shifts in consciousness. And so the way people related to one another changed in the same, and it paralleled the shifts in borders. And I think we're in that shift right now. I think there's the shift in consciousness. The way people relate to each other is shifting. The way we relate to the land, the environmental justice, the way that we treated this land so poorly. And we have to change. We have to change. And so the shifts in consciousness to all these different things, consumerism, products, right? The common good now is starting to be talked about more and more and more. And so these shifts in consciousness, we have to be sure to understand how we redefine our relationships to all these different things. And that even means how we redefine our community and what it means. I think higher education has not done a good job, right? In terms of helping someone understand the social construction of race and the social construction of identity and how it helps to promote and reinforce dehumanizing practices. And so we need to unpack that more. We need to deconstruct it, and we need to make sure higher education is part of that shift in consciousness. And
Thank
one
you.
other thing,
Oh, go ahead.
everyone on this call is participating in that shift. And so I'm honored and I'm thankful that you're here.
Great. So we're going to take some questions. Hopefully they get relayed to us, or because I was only able to take down the first one. So we'll start with that one. The question was to speak on this concept of raza cósmica, the fifth race. Anyone have thoughts on that?
Lara, I know you have some knowledge of this.
I think the participant is asking about the Raza Cósmica Vasconcelos. I think that was in the chat. I think it's an aspirational idea. I think it's someone writing from a place of pain, of recognizing dehumanization and recognizing how these labels that are racial divide people. And so Raza Cósmica is really saying sometime in the future, we'll all come together and celebrate our human likeness, right? So even though it seems like we're very divided right now as human beings, I think there's an internal little core desire to have those differences fall away so that everyone can just experience full humanity. So I don't think we're there, but I think that, like Dr. Natividad, Nick was saying, all of us on this call represent that desire that Vasconcelos was speaking to, that we don't have to fear each other and judge each other and be judged. So I think we're in that direction, moving in that direction.
I just want to take a minute and echo what Eduardo has said. The only way for there to be change is for people to get involved and to be the change. Someone in the chat on YouTube had suggested Make Change, the Sean King book, as a recommendation. But it's incumbent upon all of us to be that change. So often we are led to believe that one voice doesn't matter, but it is the collaboration of many voices that can insist on change in this society. So regardless, as Eddie said, what side of the aisle you fall on, be part of the change. Get out, vote for whomever you're going to vote for, get out and vote, and pay attention to the issues that are on the ballot. This is more than a presidential race. There are people that are running for the state legislature who have some very polarizing ideas. Become informed and be part of the change.
So I wanted to say something that I think as more questions come in, I wanted to add, if you all don't mind. You know, Dulcinea was talking about celebration and being celebratory. And we've also been talking about the complexities, right, of identity. And I guess I wanted to go back to one of the terms that one of the terms we hear a lot of is Chicanx and Latinx. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I'll come back to celebration about that. But before we were on, Dr. Lara was talking about how lots of students are coming into our classes now with, in some cases, much richer ideas about identity than have been available before, right? Or and they're challenging us to think about that. And I think Latinx and Chicanx, because most of us grew up talking about Chicanos and Chicanas, Latinos and Latinas. And I think people who use Chicanx and Latinx are really trying to blur the gender binary and are asking us to think about that and what that means, because there are a lot of people in our world who don't identify in the binary, or may identify in part of the binary, but also want to question the gender binary that exists for us. And I wanted to come back to both that and the idea of getting involved in politics or changing the way our museums are, is that all of that sometimes we can look at that as work that we have to do, but in many ways, given where we are, that should be celebration, celebratory work, joyful work, because we're working to create the world that we want to live in. And so I like the idea of these multiple themes, right, of challenge and work and celebration coming together as we move forward.
Thank you. Okay, some more questions have appeared in the chat. How do we break down this false social construct? It has to be outside of the halls of academia as well as within. Yes, how? Any takers on that?
I think, sorry, I'll always jump in when I hear silence. How do we break down the false social construct? By being the change. Like I said, I don't check boxes at the university because they require you to be one thing. I'm either Hispanic or I'm white, or I'm Black or I'm Indigenous. I'm kind of proud that New Mexico State at least breaks it down by tribal affiliation. But it speaks to what Dr. Torres said. There are people who are two-spirited, but you don't get to check that box. You have to be the one that breaks the social construct and stands up and says, no, I'm not going to check that box for you. I am who I am, and you need to accept me for who I am, and don't label me because your label will be wrong.
Great. Another common question is, are there any joint efforts or dialogues with some of our sister institutions down south, like UTEP or the universities in Ciudad Juarez, on representation in the borderlands, cognitive dissonance, becoming the oppressor, and or creating change via student leadership in higher education?
So I'll just add a few things on that, and actually it's the point above as well, the question about false social constructs. I think Patricia Hill Collins said it best when she talked about, depending on your social location, each individual derives varying amounts of penalty and privilege, right? And so part of breaking down that false social construct has to do with understanding first, of course, that it is social construct, but the own biases within ourselves. And so, and not only that, but how our own social location does allow us to have penalty and privilege. And so in the borderlands, I think we're very unique to understand this, right? To understand how a person can be the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time. And that we're living in these worlds, right? Constant, these realities. And so I think part of, yes, we need to vote. Yes, we need to protest. Yes, we need to run for office. Yes, we need to change laws. Yes, we need to do all these things. And I think the hardest part of it, though, is doing the biased, or not doing, but understanding your own biases within on a day-to-day basis and understanding how that relates to your own penalty and privilege. And so one thing that we should really start to consider too here in the borderlands is how we have this unique voice. And the borderlands, for whatever reason, I mean, not whatever reason, it's systematic, right? That our voice and our understanding about this complexity on penalty and privilege doesn't extend beyond the border. And so we have to make sure that we extend it beyond that, that we can talk about how we have this unique perspective about penalty and privilege and extend it beyond that as well, across the United States. And so just wanted to add that as well.
Okay, a question here. As we strive towards change, how do we make sure it isn't shallow and token? Putting brown faces to virtual signal.
I think we need to recognize the tokenization, and it takes a lot of courage to say no to being invited by institutions to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion if it's not going to be meaningful. And, you know, I sit on many committees, and sometimes we go a little bit further and other times you don't. And I think for people who are in authoritative positions within institutions, don't tokenize this work. It's work that's tacked on as extra to people who are already with their plates full. And so I would appeal to administration to say, if you're going to form these committees, make sure that they're not tokenized. And then to people that are doing this work, I'm starting to hear teachers who are organizing and saying, I'll do equity council work. I need to be compensated for that extra work. So I think in terms of organizing, it means that we say outright, this work cannot be tokenized. These are our expectations. This is what we want to come out of this committee. That's easier said than done. And I've served on many committees with my dear colleague, Michael Ray, who asked that question. But I think it's going to take people sort of standing together to say, we expect more from this work that's being done. The other thing is, this work isn't radical. It's reasonable, it's place-based, it's from the heart. And so I think we need to start claiming a space of reasonable action, right? Because I think it's scary to be labeled as a radical or outspoken, vocal person. And we think that there's backlash that will come with that. I think to stand together and say, we're the committee that's making reasonable recommendations in a reasonable timeline with reasonable resources behind it, I think that changes the conversation, but it is tough. I think that's a really good question to ask.
And if anyone else has anything to say, please jump in. Otherwise,
I'd like to just comment briefly, and I may not have a complete answer to Mr. Ray's question, but I think it is a good question. But some of the things that I've had the I guess unpleasant experience is when you try to get involved in certain spaces and they see a Latino face and it's like, oh great, can you translate this document for me? Or can you call these people with Spanish surnames that I have on this list? So being able to say no, like Dr. Lara mentioned, is really important. It's really important that they don't minimize your experiences and just utilize you to deliver their message. Instead, insert yourself to craft that message yourself using your experiences, because I think far too often, we're used to just translate or do the legwork of the people at the top.
Okay, next question is from, I don't know if they're alumni or just studied at NMSU, but it's two parts. One, this person says, I noted that many of you identified as Chicano, Chicana. When I was at NMSU, it was viewed as sort of this foreign label. Is that changing? And the second part is, we've recently seen a great deal about statues, memorials, celebratory holidays for people who have done harm to communities of color, and whether or not they should be taken down or dismantled. Can you share some thoughts on this?
May I share about the first part of that question? Sadly, when I came to NMSU in 2012, and then I started teaching my course, Testimonios from the Borderlands, plug-in for that course is going to be offered in the spring semester. Unfortunately, many folks rejected actually the term Chicana, Chicano, and it wasn't until they started reading and seeing themselves in the literature, in the books, in the curriculum, in the content, or when they saw somebody who kind of looked like them, that they began to embrace it and problematize the word Hispanic. There's a poem that says, I'm not her nor his, I'm nobody's panic. And I think of that, when I first got here and how sad I felt that we were so close to Mexico and that there's conflict around not only the terminology, but embracing its political and ideological roots. And I'm grateful that now we have the Ethnic Studies Graduate Certificate. I am thankful that we have faculty of color at an HSI, MSI, but we definitely need more. And going back to the earlier question around being an HSI, there's great work being done by Gina Ann Garcia around what it means to be Hispanic serving in a Hispanic serving institution. Are we Hispanic enrolling or Hispanic serving? Now being in this position in Chicano programs, I get to see a lot of brown students, a lot of brown folks, various folks come through the doors of Chicano programs. But I think we need to do more, especially being the university that we are, where we are located, being a land-grant institution. There's a lot more that we can do around that. So unfortunately, I think that there's knowledge that comes with embracing the term Chicana, Chicano, or Chicanx, and we have a long ways to go to get there. But I am hopeful. I think we have a great, promising programs that are undergoing, great relationships that we are developing with the community. And I think it's finally, we're starting to see some of these, having these conversations even. I think this conversation itself is one of those pieces that give me hope in my position right now. So we also want to see more people of color, not just in positions of, as faculty and as administrators, I'll just be honest, that do the work that is needed to change not only the awareness, but the dynamics among ourselves as Latinx peoples.
Jose, if I can touch on that.
Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful conversation, and I love the way things are materializing. As an educator, of course, I think that's a good conduit in which we can promote these ideas. So at the academic level, yes, there are some of us who are moving towards changing the social studies standards here in the state of New Mexico. And of course, that's going to filter down into our K-12 schools, which is wonderful. And I think at this point in time, there are school districts around the state who are clamoring for ethnic studies, and they're wanting this information in their curriculum, which is wonderful. Another thing, or another idea that comes to my mind, is that perhaps we should tap into the knowledge that our students have to share. And some of us have already have been involved with MECHA, and which is wonderful because we used their knowledge to promote some of these ideas, realizing that the movements, well, actually it started before the 60s and 70s, but I was part of the 60s and 70s, and I was able to contribute to that movimiento in some ways. I would like to make further concerted efforts to reach our youth. Teach our K-12 university level students. Let's touch bases with them. And of course, our teachers out in the public schools.
Thank you. How about the second question? I don't know if some of you may have missed it, but this notion about dismantling statues, for example, holidays, memorials that are being questioned now after so long, right, of acceptance. Any thoughts on that?
I wanted to speak to that, Jose, and thank you, Charlene. She is a graduate of NMSU. It's nice to see you, Charlene, in name at least. You know, the name of Oñate High School was changed here in the last couple of months to Organ Mountain High School. So I know that you knew about Oñate High School and that memorialization. That was a big controversy in the community, and actually more people spoke out to keep the name than to do away with it in a survey that was released. However, the school board, through contentious conversation, changed it away from Oñate. The other piece that I mentioned earlier was the mascot of Pistol Pete, which again, that's a beloved figure in our community, but there's been activity amongst faculty at NMSU and students to challenge the use of guns and the statuary of Pistol Pete as being sort of, I think it's been discussed as aggressive or violent. And so I think with these conversations that are really tricky, especially with the Oñate controversy, I know people have loved that mascot for 20, 30 years now. I know that it's a fixture in our community. So part of these hard conversations are to recognize where people are coming from as well, and not just sort of blindly privilege one perspective, but to take all of it into consideration. And that's why to not know history it prevents us from having these conversations about who was Oñate really and who chose Pistol Pete, right? If we look back to see the conversations about those decisions, then we have some information to make decisions that are better for youth in the future, that are better for our communities. So things are changing slowly but surely here in Las Cruces, Charlene, but they're very hard conversations. And people are now talking about the water tower mural on Loman and the depiction of indigenous people being enslaved, right? So these aren't like native, not native conversations. I think the movement that's happening globally is one that's counter violence, counter aggression, and really looking for a better, healthier society. Judith just mentioned the Hadley Hall mural. There's a lot of really problematic imagery on campus and within the community as well.
Yes, as someone who likes history and reading, I find these incidences that are happening all around our country to be opportunities to educate our students and our children. Unfortunately, what we teach at the public school, at least at the high school level in terms of history, is very, very different than what gets exposed at the college and university. In fact, in my experience, it was quite shocking. So there tends to be this watered down, very, I can't find the right word, but I want to say just dominant narrative of what US history is, for example, and there's so much more to it. So I for one, would recommend and support allowing our students and allowing our children, if we have them, or our neighbors, to ask and to find out about why is that happening? Why the controversy over Oñate? Take those as golden opportunities to explore, to read, to research, and then they hopefully can come away with their own conclusions and a better understanding. Anyone else have comment on that?
I'd just like to share a text message that I received from my father, who's watching this discussion. He likes to joke about this issue a lot because he said when he was a kid, he thought he was a pilgrim. You know, he thought his history was, you know, he landed at Plymouth Rock because of that watered down version of history. And you're right. I think, you know, we need to, you know, understand that history is very complex and our history is very different, but nonetheless American. And you know, that for many years, my father said he just thought that was his history. He thought he was a pilgrim. He was a descendant of a pilgrim, but that's not the truth. Couldn't be further from the truth. But yeah, you know, we need to make some changes.
Good point, good point. And you know,
There's
the
a-
information's out there. We just have to reach out. I'm sorry.
May I read a couple of comments from YouTube?
Sure.
I just thought I would share because we're celebrating as well. From Sonia Saiz, I would say the same about the current New Mexico history curriculum being taught. It needs to be changed. Jean says, I agree with Dr. Natividad. I search for my own biases daily and work to disintegrate any I come across. Catherine says that this work always starts with ourselves. To create change, we must be willing to change first.
Yes, indeed. Before we wrap up, I want to offer our panelists one more opportunity to say any last words.
Jose, if I can chime in.
Yes.
We've spoken about curriculum and those kinds of strategies, and I offered some strategies on or that we should reach to our youth to get some input from them, and they can help us with this movimiento. The other thing that I think that I've been researching is the idea of resolana. I mentioned this during one of our conversations previously, and resolana is typically where the community comes together and they talk to each other and they solve issues and they extract el oro del barrio. Now, in this scenario, it doesn't matter if what you do as a profession, everybody is heard with equal respect. Because of our current pandemic, those environments have kind of dissipated, and I have seen a few of them that are no longer existent. So I was thinking, how can we create this in the digital world? And in celebration, I think we're doing this here tonight. We're coming together and we're starting to discuss these ideas, and we're starting to offer some solutions. So thank you for everyone who has helped me with my research and my pursuit of moving Resolana into the virtual environment.
Thank you, Dr. Bustamante. Anyone else? Dr. Natividad, go ahead.
Say one more thing. I think the pandemic has forced us to be indoors, right? Consistently, and look in the mirror more often than than we have in the past. And that inward gaze, a lot of times people find out they don't like a lot of the things that they're doing and who they're becoming, and the waste and the consumerism and all these things that have engrossed people for so long. And so I think this is a transformative time, and especially for the borderland region, a place that has seen so much suffering. I think Richard Rohr, who's a very prolific writer, talks a lot about taking suffering and transforming it into love. And so what does that love look like? You know, when you look deeply inside yourself and start to see, I don't want to treat the land that way. I don't want to treat another human being that way. I don't want other human beings to be treated that way. And so taking that and transforming into love, and love looks different, right? Love looks like planting a tree. Love looks like educating your children differently. Love looks all these different ways, and acknowledging that. I think I'm hoping that the pandemic will allow us to again shift consciousness to allow that love to grow within us differently.
So Jose, I've got some closing comments, just kind of in listening to the whole group, if I can do that. You know, when I think about the kinds of conversation we've had tonight, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is the complexity of identity, right? I mean, we didn't even scratch the surface, right? We kind of gestured toward the surface to start scratching in terms of the complexity and the richness of identity, and how the complexity of it for any individual, much less a group of people in conversation. I think the second point that I was hearing in some very compelling ways is the importance of history, right? And story as part of history. That we really need to know that it makes a difference in terms of how we understand the world, how we understand ourselves in the world, and we act in the world. And then I was really struck by the way people talked about how do we do the hard work that we need to do. But we talked about hard work in a variety of ways. We talked about it, the self work we need to do, and some of that is about reflection, right, and how we're positioned in the world and what that means. But several talked also about, and it's funny to call this hard work, but it is sometimes in our circumstances, and that is self-care, right? How do we take care of ourselves in kind of the moments as we're doing some of this work? We talked about hard work also being the intellectual work we need to do. We talked about the interpersonal work we need to do, and I think it's really lovely to talk about it as love, right? But love and challenge, perhaps both. Others talked about the political work we need to do at this time, and as Nick said, we're in a period of transition, right? So much around us demonstrates that we're in a period of transition, and so now is the time to do the hard work, to continue to do the hard work, but also take care of ourselves as part of that work. So I just wanted to thank everybody. I don't get very many conversations like this right now in the line of work that I'm in. And so it's just an incredible honor to be able to have listened to you tonight and to engage. So thank you. I just wanted to make a few final observations. Thank you, Jose.
I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight via Facebook Live, YouTube live stream, and of course to our fabulous, amazing, inspiring panelists. I know, as Dr. Torres said, we're just scratching the surface of all of these very complex topics, but it's also an opportunity for us to inform ourselves, educate ourselves, do some readings. Those that want the books, yay! Those that want the posters, phenomenal. Please email Marisela. You have the email address, and get in touch with us so that we get those to you. Reminder that we have a closing panel of two phenomenal, not a panel, speakers on Thursday at 5 p.m. Chicano Programs thanks you. Doña Ana Community College thanks you. And the Honors College. Muchas gracias to everybody and have a great night.